Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Nantucket Historical Association's webinar on the whale hunt. And I'm very excited about presenting this to you tonight. We have over 230 people participating, which is absolutely shocking. We're just delighted. So we're going to be talking tonight about what it was like on a whale hunt. This presentation will last about 20 minutes. And after that, I'd be more than happy to take any questions that I hope I can answer for you. So I think we're just about ready to begin. So welcome and delighted. Take out your map and look at it. See what a real corner of the world it occupies. Those are the words of Herman Melville in chapter 14 of Moby Dick. Melville was talking about Nantucket, our tiny little island, 30 miles at sea, about 15 miles long, but this little island became the whaling capital of the world. A really major accomplishment for a little place like Nantucket. So tonight we're going to go on the voyage of the Edward Cary. And this is going to be captained by Perry Winslow. And the voyage lasted from 1854 to 1858. And he's going to be accompanied on this voyage with by his wife, whose name is Mary Ann, and two of their children, Mary and John, will be joining them on this voyage. And here we have a young man whose name is Joseph Ray, and Joseph kept a journal throughout this voyage. So a lot of the drawings that you will be seeing came from Joseph Ray. And he was a 21-year-old Nantucket boy, hired to go out on the Edward Cary, and his job is going to be boat steerer and harpooner. So that means that when they lower the whale boats from the whale ship, when they're actually pursuing a whale, Joseph will be in the bow of the ship. So he will first be using an oar to help row toward the whale, but when they approach the whale, he will also be the harpooner, the person who's going to harpoon the whale. And Joseph joins the rest of the crew. And these are men from really all over. There are men from Fall River, Buffalo, Boston, Nantucket, of course, because the captains and the mates are most likely from Nantucket. And there's also a man from the Azores. And as the Edward Cary sails all over the world, they will be picking up other sailors along the way. So that will add to the diversity of the crew. Diverse whaling crews created the first meritocracy in the colonies. Any young man who could prove his worth could climb up the ladder and eventually achieve success on a whaling voyage. Maybe he'd become a mate, maybe he'd even become a captain. And pictured here, we have Absalom Boston, who is the first African-American captain of a whale ship with an all-black crew. So the Edward Cary is going to leave, as I said, in 1854, and this is a really emotional time when a whaling voyage departed from Nantucket. Most of the town would be down waving goodbye, saying fair winds and greasy luck, because these men are going to be away from the town for 4 years. That's a really long time to be away from your loved ones and your home. And there was one whaling voyage that lasted 11 years. And on this particular voyage, the Edward Cary is going to go around the Cape of Good Hope, around the tip of Africa, into the Indian Ocean, and eventually into the Pacific, hunting whales. And primarily, they're going to be looking for sperm whales. Why? Why do they want to get sperm whales? Well, there's a clue. The scientific name of sperm whales is Physeter macrocephalus, which means large, square-headed whale. And that is the secret. When you look inside the whale's head there, which makes almost a third of its body, you will see this chamber. And in that chamber are anywhere from 300 to 500 gallons of spermaceti oil, which was the finest oil in the world, let alone the oil that came from the blubber of the whale also. And the qualities of spermaceti oil were really amazing. It had this viscosity, which was very stable. It was not affected by really cold temperatures or really hot temperatures. It would stay the same. So the lighthouses of the world were lit with this wonderful spermaceti oil, as were the street lamps in northern cities, London and France, all over. So they were selling this oil all over the world. And also, after all the oil was refined, what was left is what they made spermaceti candles out of. And these were a remarkable product. They burned very brightly, very cleanly. They lasted a long time. And actually, spermaceti oil made such a huge difference in people's lives, because before they had this wonderful product, they had to go to bed when the sun went down and get up when the sun rose. But now they could extend their day. The majority of the crew will share the forecastle, and that was a very cramped, tight space at the forward part of the ship. So this motley group of men are going to be sharing this space for a long time, 4 years. It was, the forecastle is very slimy, it's dark, it's dank, it's probably very smelly. That is where the men are going to eat, sleep, tell stories, write in their journals, play cards, and it is probably full of tobacco smoke and also infested with rats and roaches. And some of the men will certainly be very homesick in the beginning and also probably very seasick at the beginning of the voyage. This is the quarters for the captain and his family, actually a much nicer space. And they also will get much better food than the men in the forecastle. So when Joseph Ray has free time, he is going to spend a lot of time working on his journal. And he illustrates it beautifully with sights that they see, ports that they stop in. And he also writes a lot, and he tells about missing home, and he tells about reflections on what life was like on a whaling voyage. And we're very fortunate to have all of his wonderful drawings that really give us a great picture of what life was like on board a whaling ship. And believe me, it was not an easy life, as you will see. Up on the deck is where the men are actually literally learning the ropes. They'll be rigging the sails, sharpening the tools that they'll use when they encounter their whales. They'll be coiling the line that is in the whale boats and attached to the harpoons and the lances. And they'll be practicing in the whale boats. So they lower the whale boats so that they can start to learn how to maneuver these boats quickly, build up their muscles and build up the calluses on their hands, because they'll be doing a lot of rowing. Another very important job was the lookout job. And 2 men would climb the highest mast on the ship, which was about 100 feet in the air. They balance on cross trees, and then they're surrounded by a metal hoop as they're pounding through the waves. And 2 men stand back to back, each one responsible for a 180-degree lookout. 100 feet up in the air, and one of the mates, they've had a long voyage, they haven't seen sperm whales for a little while, but all of a sudden, somebody spots a sperm whale, and they know that it is a sperm whale because of the spout. Sperm whales have a very distinct spout. It kind of blows out of the left side of their head at a 45-degree angle. So now the mate up there says, "There she blows, she blows." And the captain, who is down on the deck, will say, "Launch the whale boats." So every man runs to his assigned whale boat. The first thing they do as they get in their boat is take off their shoes, because sperm whales have a very sensitive sense of hearing, and they don't want to make a lot of noise in these wooden whale boats. But also, they probably only own 1 pair of shoes, so they don't want to take any chances on losing their shoes. So we have Joseph up in the bow. He is using his big oar to help steer, but as they approach the whale, the boat's header, who is the officer in the stern, will tell him to put down his oar and pick up his harpoon as they are nearing the whale, or as they say, wood to leather. So now Joseph has harpooned the whale. The harpoon does not kill the whale. However, it does get his attention. So the whale is going to take off swimming as fast as he can go. And a whale can swim maybe 10, 15 miles an hour. So Joseph is urging everybody on so he can now harpoon this whale. And this wild ride that they're on is called the Nantucket sleigh ride. Certainly the most exciting part of the whale hunt, but also very dangerous. Some of the men are just hanging on for dear life. Others are coiling wetting down the line as it goes around the loggerhead. Some are bailing water out of the boat. This is an exciting but very dangerous time. But the idea is eventually the whale will get very tired. And when the whale starts to tire, they will pull in on the line again and get close to the whale again. Now we have a switch in positions. The officer, the boat header, has moved to the bow and Joseph has moved to the stern. And now we have the officer who is going to use a lance. And he is the person who will have the honor of actually killing the whale. So the officer takes up his lance. He's going to aim for the heart and the lungs of the whale, because those are the vital organs, the life of the whale. And he will plunge in his lance, maybe all the way up to the hilt, and then he'll churn it around to do as much damage as he can. This was really a horrible way for a whale to die. And once the whale has been lanced, everyone just waits, and they're waiting to see the whale spouting blood, and they will yell out, "Fire in the chimney." They know that a vital organ has been hit, and they know that that whale is going to die. And as soon as they know the whale is dying, they back away from the whale as fast as they can. A dying whale can go into a death flurry where they might circle the boat many times. Their huge flukes could tip the boat over, and all those men end up in the water. And unfortunately, most of them did not know how to swim. The Edward Cary has been fairly fortunate to come across a good-sized pod of sperm whales. And now whoever has caught a whale has to get that whale back to the mother ship. The mother ship stays in one position, and each whaleboat that has caught a whale needs to tow their whale back. So they could be 3 miles away on the Nantucket sleigh ride. That would be 3 hours of rowing just to get back to the ship. And you can imagine they're carrying a very heavy load. These whales can be anywhere from 40, 50, even 60 tons. And you'd think that this poor exhausted crew could do a little rest, but not so. They immediately start the cutting in process. They lower a platform off the side of the ship and start the cutting in. And one of the men will actually stand on the back of the whale, and he has cleats in his shoes so that he doesn't fall into the water where sharks might be circling. But his job is to put a big hole in the top of the head, attach a big blubber hook, which is attached to a winch, and now they can start to peel away the blubber from the whale. And these pieces of blubber that they're peeling away are called blanket pieces. They were about 15 feet long, and they were enormously heavy. So they would raise them up onto the deck with a winch. And then these huge pieces go to the mincing area, where men use two-handled knives to cut these huge pieces of blubber into smaller pieces. So now you can see them cutting them up into a little bit smaller pieces, yes. So those are called Bible leaves. Next thing they do is probe the intestine and the stomach of the whale. And they're looking for something very specific. Sperm whale's favorite food is squid. And all squid have a horny beak. To think about what a parrot's beak looks like. And that is indigestible. And it can get lodged in the stomach or the intestines of the whale. And if that happens, the scar tissue forms around that beak, and that produced a substance called ambergris. And ambergris had a very important use. It was a rare find, but if they found it, it was used as a fixative in fine perfumes, so it had a high monetary value. Next, they cut off the head of the whale, they let the rest of the carcass go, and they bring that head right up onto the deck of the ship. They make a big hole in the top of the head, and now they go after this valuable spermaceti oil, bucket it out, many, many buckets. And the youngest, smallest man on board, who could be Joseph Ray, is going to be ordered to strip down and lower himself with a bucket into the head of the whale to get every last drop of that very valuable oil. Imagine how shocked he is. And lastly, they cut off the lower jaw of the whale because they're going to save those teeth. Sperm whales' teeth are made out of ivory. And when there was downtime on a whaling voyage, when they weren't out catching whales, the captain would distribute the teeth among the crew. And then the men would take a rough tooth, sand it down, And then they would carve or engrave into the tooth, maybe scenes that they'd seen on their voyage, or maybe some memory of home. And they fill in those carved lines, those engraved lines, with soot from the try works or dried ink. And that was the art of scrimshaw, which was known as the sailor's art. Now it's time to clean up the deck in preparation for actually boiling down all the blubber. So the ship's carpenter will get the fire going under the try pots in the try works. The try works are a brick furnace, basically. And they put in these Bible leaves, these chunks of blubber. And there will also be skin and tissue that will float up to the top. And that will be skimmed off with a skimmer and added to the fire. So they kept the fire going. Now, trying out a whale was really a long, arduous process. It could take up to 2 or 3 days and nights. No regular meals. They just kept working in 12-hour shifts. And you can imagine the deck would be awash with blood and oil and blubber, and it would just be a slippery, nasty mess, and actually very dangerous. And the smell was horrendous. Supposedly, you could smell a Nantucket whale ship that was trying out a whale as much as 30 miles away. So you could smell it way before you could see it. The Edward Cary has been quite lucky, and they now have killed 35 whales. And the captain says, set sail for Nantucket. Now you can imagine these men are homeward bound. They are really ready to go home. The first thing they do when they know that they're on their way home is they break apart the try works. They just throw it overboard. They don't want the captain to be tempted to take any more whales. They want to be sure they're on their way home. So on their way home this time, they're now seasoned navigators and sailors, and they go around the Horn and they arrive in Nantucket in 1858. And they offload all these barrels and casks of oil that they have accumulated. These will all go to an oil refinery and candle factory for further processing. And finally, it is time to pay out the lay, or tell the men what they have earned on this voyage. A captain, and certainly a ship owner, could become a wealthy man after just one whaling voyage. But someone like Joseph, our boat steerer, will probably receive approximately 1/100th of the proceeds of the voyage. And a lowly seaman would receive 1/160th of the proceeds. Joseph has kept such a wonderful journal and told so many wonderful stories in his journal. It's really quite exciting to read. And I will tell you about one of the adventures when he talks about rescuing a fellow Nantucketer. On Thursday, April 12th at 9 a.m., the cry of a man overboard resounded throughout the ship. The wind blowing heavy succeeded in reaching him as he was about to give up. He had a bucket under him, which fortunately happened to go over at the same time. The name of the lad was Samuel Christian. And in another entry from the journal, on Sunday, August 27th, 1854, Joseph describes the hard work that took place on a whale ship. Working like the old Harry, putting spars over the stern, lashing boats, making gaskets, frigging with stun sails, and all of us homesick as the devil. So ends this 24 hours of trial and tribulation. So what happened to young Joseph Ray? Well, after this voyage, he went out on another whaling voyage out of Mystic, Connecticut. And unfortunately, he was up in the sails and he fell from the foremast yard and was lost at sea. And what happened to the Edward Cary? Well, it went out on another voyage from 1858 to 1864, and then stopped in San Francisco where it was sold and resumed its whaling. But then in 1865, it was captured and burned by the Confederate raider, Shenandoah, and that was the end of the Edward Cary. And so now whaling was completely over by the time of the Civil War in Nantucket. And people would think that probably the 18th or the 19th century was the heyday of whaling. But actually, it was more of the 20th century when Soviet fleets, European fleets, Asian fleets started hunting whales for meat rather than for oil. And surprisingly, in the 200 years of whaling that Nantucket was doing, approximately 1 million whales were killed. But in the 50 or 60 years of more modern whaling, where they have big factory ships and grenades and harpoon guns and so on, over 3 million, it is estimated that over 3 million whales have been killed. And whale populations are still quite threatened. They really are under considerable threat from noise levels, loud drilling in the sea, from pollution and garbage, entanglement with fishing gear, and collisions with other ships. So that is the end of our whale hunt for the evening. I am so glad that so many people were able to join us, and I would be more than happy to take questions at this point.
Okay, we've got a few questions here.
All right.
First one is on the sperm oil bottle. Was sperm oil in fact used as a gargle?
It was. It sounds very peculiar, doesn't it? But we do have that bottle in the Whaling Museum, and indeed it was used as a gargle. Doesn't sound too appealing, does it?
We have a question about the visuals for the whaling boat from the early movie, and what was it, and was the ship the Charles Morgan?
I think it was, but
it was Charles.
It was the Charles Morgan. Okay, and the movie is the silent movie that was made in the 1920s, and it's called Down to the Sea in Ships. And part of it is an actual whale hunt, but a lot of it is Hollywood's interpretation too. But it gives us some great footage anyway.
Yeah, we have a question about the photographs. What are the dates and source of the different photographs?
The photographs from the journal?
Well, it's just this, the question is, what are the dates and sources of the photographs? Well, we could talk about both. We could talk about the journal and the photos we used.
Right. So we do have these remarkable drawings and stories that Joseph Ray tells in his journal. But a lot of the other footage, as I said, is from the movie Down to the Sea in Ships. And then some of it is from our collection, of course, too.
Okay, and comment from someone say they saw Mirrick on the crew list. Was this possibly a descendant of the famous scrimshander Fred Mirrick, who was active in the 1830s?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because we do have some of our collection, and I'm not sure if it was the same. There are so many families that were connected in Nantucket, and so many that have the same first name and last name. I'm not sure. That's a great question, but I don't know.
And another question is, how did Joseph's journal survive and come to Nantucket?
I came back with Joseph, and then I don't know, certainly someone in one of his descendants was able to donate it to the Nantucket Historical Association. And we're very fortunate to have that, along with many, many other ship's journals. The research library has an amazing collection of journals and log books. And there's a great project going on right now at the research library to transcribe all these journals and log books.
And there was a question, what was it that was thrown overboard to encourage the voyage end again? The try-works?
Oh, yes. At the end of the voyage, they break apart this brick furnace, the try-works, and they throw all the bricks overboard because they don't want the captain to be tempted to take another whale. However, there's another reason for that too. They have used that try-works numerous times to try out 30 or 40 whales. And so the mortar between the bricks could become weakened. And they're going to be going around Cape Horn, which is notoriously stormy. And they don't want that try-works to break apart in a storm and damage the ship.
Okay, we've got a few more here. What were the maritime or educational requirements for men to set sail on these journeys, besides breathing?
Right. A lot of the men, especially the green hands, the first time out, really didn't need any requirements. They just had to be a body there. They needed a good crew, and they needed to season them and learn the job as they go. Now, the captains and the first mates would have been mostly Nantucket men, and they would have been much more experienced and probably much, they would have had, they'd worked their way up the ladder, so they'd learned a lot about navigation and about sailing these big ships.
And who was Edward Cary? Who was the Edward Cary that the ship was named after?
Well, I didn't know that until today, and we just found out that the original owner of the ship, whose name was Ahern, named the ship after his father-in-law. And then it was sold to other people over the years. And this particular voyage, the owners of the ship were the two Coffin brothers, who have a house on Main Street, right? The houses still exist today. And after the Coffin brothers owned the ship, then it went to the Starbuck family, and then eventually it was sold in San Francisco.
Okay, and we have a question about why don't people hunt sperm whales today?
Well, number one, there's a moratorium against hunting whales. So that started, I believe, in 1986. I think that was the year. But anyway, there is a moratorium on hunting whales for commercial purposes, although there is still some hunting commercially that is still done. But sperm whales are not easy. They are pelagic whales, which means they're in very, very deep water. So they are the whales that would migrate close by Nantucket, although we do have a sperm whale skeleton in our museum that did migrate by Nantucket, but that was a rare occasion. And so hopefully these whales will have time to recover. It is estimated that there are around 300,000 sperm whales left in the world, which isn't a great number, but hopefully enough that they will be able to survive.
Okay, and a question about this presentation itself. It said, question is this story the same one that George Grant would tell as first custodian of the Whaling Museum?
Actually, that's a great question. The hunt has changed over the years. We've done a lot of different presentations, and this is the first year that we've used the Edward Cary journal to illustrate the whale hunt. But yes, it's very similar to the one that George Grant would have started all those years ago.
So he was a whaler.
And he was a whaler.
And he was a whaler, yes, yes. Right.
Okay. Question is, when was photography first available for recording whaling? That's a good question.
Whoa. That I do not know. When did photography begin? I don't know. I really don't know. Sorry.
Mid-1800s.
Yeah, we'd have to probably look at our own photography collection. I think the earliest things we have are around early 1840s.
Okay.
But they're mostly portraits at that time. I think it's
Right.
probably difficult to take things on a ship. That's a very good question. We should look into that.
Right. Yeah. Great question.
Okay. Was it unusual to go around both capes on a single voyage?
I think it was fairly unusual. I think once Nantucketers discovered the rich whaling grounds in the Pacific, that was the quickest route would be to go generally kind of across the Atlantic, maybe make stops in the Azores, Cape Verde Islands, then along the eastern coast of South America and down around the Horn, and then up into the whaling grounds of the South Pacific. And they did a lot of their hunting along the equator, and so they're really way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So I think it is fairly unusual that this particular voyage of the Edward Cary did go around the Cape of Good Hope. But other ships did that too, but I think it was more common to go a more direct route to the Pacific.
Yeah, another navigation-related question. When did Nantucket Whalers first venture into the Southern Ocean around Antarctica?
Even on whaling voyages in the 1830s, thereabouts, they were going into the Pacific, but they also would follow the whales. They follow the migration of the whales. So whales have their young in warm water, so around the equator. But then, depending on the season, they will either go very far north to the Arctic or very far south to the Antarctica to feed, because those were the richer feeding grounds for them. So I think it just depended on the time of year.
Okay. And a little question, how were the whale teeth apportioned to the crew?
Well, I suppose whales have, it depends on the size of the whale's jaw, but they can have 30 or more teeth. And some of the men were very proficient at carving whale's teeth. They also used whale bone to carve different implements. They carved busts, which were stays in women's corsets. Those were usually made out of whale bone. And they made swifts, which were used for winding yarn. They made jagging wheels. If you've been in the scrimshaw room at the Whaling Museum, you see all the different items that were made, all under the art of scrimshaw. But I assume that the teeth were more prized, and so they would be distributed to the men who had time and inclination to carve and do designs in the teeth.
Did they eat the whale meat or discard it?
They did not eat the whale meat. First of all, we have to think about the horrible smell when you're trying out a whale. And so this was very unappealing. And in particular, sperm whales have, in order to dive so deeply, to go way down in pelagic whales, to dive so deeply, they can actually go down over a mile or two deep. They have to have something called a lot of myoglobin in their blood, which tends to give them more oxygen in order to do that, but it tends to make their meat a very dark color, kind of a dark purpley, almost black color. So it was pretty unappealing. So this was all about oil. This was not about meat for the Nantucket whalers.
Okay. And coming back to the sperm oil question again, what was the difference between the oil from the blubber and the oil from the head?
Well, the oil from the blubber had to be boiled down. The blubber is basically fat, and so it had to be boiled down. The oil in the head was pure oil. And it's the only creature in the world that has oil in its head like this. So there's been a lot of questions about why biologically does the whale have all this oil in its head? And the answer is no one really knows exactly for sure, but the supposition is that it acts as a buoyancy control, so that it allows the whale to dive so deeply and then come up quickly. But we're really not sure. It's rather hard for scientists to study whales because they're underwater most of the time.
And how competitive was Nantucket, I guess, the question is, how competitive was Nantucket and other whaling centers?
Well, certainly for a good period of time, starting in the mid-1700s through the mid-1800s, this was the only industry on this island, and Nantucketers were really premier whalemen. They really were very, very successful hunting sperm whales and the innovation of having a try-works on board. But then in the mid-1800s, certainly New Bedford began to take over. There were a number of things that happened on Nantucket that really ended the whaling business. One of those being the Great Fire of 1846, the discovery of gold in California that took so many young men away from here, the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania, which produced kerosene, began to replace whale oil, and the Civil War. So a number of things happened in a fairly short period of time that ended whaling on Nantucket, and New Bedford was really the next big whaling center. And after that, San Francisco also got into whaling. So it was over by the time of the Civil War here.
Why was it so uncommon for the crew members to not know how to swim?
That's a good question. And I think that's true. I've heard that that's true. But we think about it now. I mean, all our children go in pools and oceans and take swimming lessons and so on. But people weren't using the ocean around us as a resort or a recreation. This was business. So I think the thought of learning to swim just never occurred to them. I don't know.
Yeah. And some of them came from farms.
Right, that's good. Right.
Question, did women ever travel on whaling ships?
Yes, not very often, but only the sailors' wives were allowed to go on a whaling voyage. No other women were allowed. And it wasn't really frequent, but a number of whaling wives did go along. We have some wonderful stories in the Whaling Museum about women who accompanied their husbands on whaling voyages. There's a wonderful new book called 1,000 Leagues of Blue by Betsy Tyler, and it tells the story of Susan Veeder, who went on a voyage with her husband and kept a journal, which we have. And so that is a wonderful source of what it was like for a woman to to go out away from home was quite an adventure for women in those days. But the women that were left behind on Nantucket were very powerful women, because think about it. The men were gone and the women had to run this town, and they did so in remarkable ways. So we have a really wonderful stories of the Nantucket women who were so ahead of their time, really.
It's an interesting question here from a gentleman. It says, I was in Norway and sampled smoked whale at the Bergen Fish Market. What type of whale would they have at that market most likely?
It could be any kind of whale. Certainly, yes, the Norway and Iceland, I know, offer whale, and Japan offer whale meat as a delicacy. It could be a humpback whale. It could be minke whale. It could, I don't know. I mean, it could have been different kinds of whale.
We have a little correction here from one of our old friends,
Okay.
Jim Borzilleri. You remember Jim?
Borzilleri, yes.
Borzilleri, oh, good old Jim. Anyway, he said that it appears that in Down to the Sea and ships that the Morgan was used for static scenes, and a different ship, the whaling bark Wanderer, was re-rigged for some of the actual whaling scenes. He said nitpicky, but we'll have to if that's great information to clean up our act a little bit.
Yes, exactly.
Hi, Jim.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a question here about the presentation that they see it's being recorded. Will it be posted somewhere for replay or to share with others?
Yes, I'm not sure when and where, but yes, we did record this. So we'll post it on our website when the time comes.
Okay. Another one's, given our proximity to the Stellwagen banks in Wales, was there local hunting here in New England?
Oh yes, certainly the early whaling on Nantucket was right around Nantucket. There were whales migrating by here, particularly the North Atlantic right whale, and that whale migrates up and down the East Coast. But yes, the early whaling, before they had try-works on board, they didn't have the option of going out for 3 or 4 years on a whaling voyage. They had to, if they caught a whale, they had to get back to Nantucket to process the whale before the blubber was rancid. So yes, there was a lot of whaling in the early days right around here.
We have a comment about Antarctic whaling. And the comment is that there were also Greenlandic whaling stations on South Georgia Island, Stromness Harbor, probably the closest point to the Antarctic Peninsula.
Right.
Okay.
We have some, oh, go ahead.
Greenland's north. I'm confused. Anyway.
Yes, but yes. But again, we have some dramatic stories in journals and logbooks and a painting in the museum that all tell how difficult it was when they were really in the Arctic area, because often the ships would get stuck in the ice, and that could be very fatal, because if the ice closes in, it can collapse the ship. So very, very dangerous. But there were a lot of whales up there, so you can see why they would go.
I have a question. Is it possible to purchase spermaceti candles today?
No. Okay. It is illegal to hunt sperm whales. It's illegal to hunt whales, so no.
And okay, this is our last question. I think we're going to end on the high note.
Okay.
With the men away, did women rule?
Yes, most definitely.
Oh, I see the kind of correction on the whaling station. It was a whaling station manned by Greenlanders. It wasn't a Greenland station. Thank you for that.
Okay.
And that's the end of our list here.
Well, good.
Lots of thanks, lots of good
question.
comments.
Yes.
And this is terrific.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us, and we'll look forward to doing this again sometime.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.